Okay, so for today's class, we're going to be discussing. We're going back to Alexander Pope, and we'll be discussing one of his most famous poems, an essay on man. Now, we're only reading part of it. We're reading the first section of it. There are four sections of it in its entirety, and and actually, the whole poem that we have was intended to be part of a much longer philosophical poem that Pope never got around to completing. We only have fragments of it. We have the essay on man, and we have the moral essays that he wrote that are engaging in their own right. But he never got to complete the entire work that he had planned. The essay on man, and we'll see this in the parts that we're reading, is a it belongs to a genre uh, that really doesn't get a lot of attention. It's a philosophical poem. We tend to think, and we've talked about this at various times, we tend to think of poetry as being a vehicle for expressing one's feelings or one's impressions. We think of it uh, as a venue for the lyric and the personal, and of course it is that. Pope is drawing on an older tradition and one that's largely been lost, and that is using poetry as a way of communicating the sorts of ideas that we would communicate either scientifically or philosophically. And if we think of the way that those uh, kinds of ideas tend to be communicated in our own culture, we want them communicated through prose, and now we're thinking of science, but also some kinds of philosophy. We want those ideas communicated in the clearest, most concise, most accurate language. The very things that we value in poetry, the ambiguity, the tension, the creativity, the use of metaphor and rhetoric, all of those things we want to get out of our scientific and philosophical writing, so the writings are clear, they're precise, there's no room for misinterpretation. Those kinds of writings, of course, existed in Pope's age, but there were also older kinds of traditions that said that poetry could become a vehicle through which the the masses, the ordinary readers, could come to understand and also, quite importantly, to remember those important philosophical ideas. We can look for a lot of antecedents for this. We can go back to our friend Lucretius that we talked about in Swift and his De Rerum Natura, which tried to take, not tried, but did take Epicurean atomic philosophy and made it understandable for ordinary readers. We could look to Virgil, who we remember most often for his great epic poem, but we could also look to his Georgic poems, which are beautiful in their own right and don't receive the attention that they should, which were poems that were really about agriculture, not only celebrating the beauties of agriculture, but also uh, giving people practical advice on how to make the land most abundant. These kinds of poetic traditions existed into the 18th century. In fact, they created they not created, but they experienced a kind of resurgence. And Pope's poem should really be seen as part of that tradition. Uh, I've sometimes described this poem as being a part of popular culture, and boy, that seems odd to us. We think of our own popular culture, and we think of things like YouTube videos, and we think of the social media, and we television shows and movies. And boy, this poem by Alexander Pope, which is hard for us to read and doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, seems so far removed from that. But in Pope's age, it really wasn't. This was written for a learned but a popular audience, and it was designed to take ideas that would have been uh, less accessible in the philosophical writings that it's based on, and make them more memorable, more accessible, more understandable to a modern audience. So as you're reading it, I want you to notice not only the kind of wisdom that's built into it, but also appreciate the kind of tone that's being used, which is sometimes playful. There's a speaker here who's engaging and who's trying to grab our attention. This is also a poem that's trying to draw together a lot of different kind of philosophical traditions. It has been said, and Maynard Max says this, I think, quite usefully, that it is a response to the kind of materialism and also the kind of pessimism that we find in writers like Thomas Hobbes. It's also trying to draw together a lot of different kinds of threads. We see Pope exploring the idea of a great chain of being. That's not an idea that's really contemporary in the 18th century. It's one that goes back to it has a lot of early antecedents in the classical world and definitely in the Renaissance world. In fact, if you want to learn about the Great Chain of Being, a good book to consult is it's a short book by E.M.W. Tilliard called The Elizabethan Worldview. That book, like Basil Willey's The 17th Century Background, it's charged a lot of times with being overly simplistic, and it is. It paints with a broad brush. It doesn't get everything quite right, but for giving us an understanding of the broad philosophical tenets, it's still, I think, tremendously useful. It's one that I would definitely recommend to those of you who are going to be teaching Shakespeare or Renaissance literature or really any of the early modern British literature in, say, a high school class. It's not an endpoint. It's not what I would use in a scholarly article, but boy, it'll still give you good background that's accessible and that'll work for your students. That's E.M.W. Tilliard, The Elizabethan Worldview. Those of you going on to be high school teachers, you will want that in your toolbox. It's a good thing for you to have. And Pope is using those ideas uh, of a great chain of being and of a kind of integrated world all throughout this poem. In some ways, we can think of this poem as trying to answer the question of why is it so difficult to be a person? Uh, Being a person is hard. Uh, we have minds that lead us towards great abstraction and that cause us to ask questions that we can't quite answer. We have enough knowledge of how things will unfold that we know that uh, things won't end well for us. We all have to experience death, and death is probably going to be uh, prefigured by pain and suffering. The nature of life is the nature of loss, and we have the burden of knowing this. We can imagine better worlds than the ones that we will ever be able to live in. We have, in some ways, the aspirations of angels, but yet we're stuck in the bodies of animals. Well, Pope will answer this by saying that there is a great chain of being, that nature has to be complete, that every part of creation from God down to the rocks has to be filled, and it's our unfortunate position to be right in the middle, to have that link right between the angelic and the animalistic. That's our place, and there's really nothing that we can do about it. Uh, and he will describe that position with what seems at times to be a great deal of optimism. Um, let's look just at the end of this first epistle that we have in some of these most famous lines. Heaven bestows on thee submit in this or in any other sphere, secure to be as blessed as thou canst bear, safe in the hand of one disposing power, or in the natal or the mortal hour. All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance direction with which thou canst not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil, universal good. And in spite of pride and erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. Those are difficult ideas sometimes to reconcile with, maybe, and they're difficult for us in our time when we are seeing the a pandemic emerge, and it's pretty hard to think that whatever is right. They're reminiscent of some of the kind of wisdom that some of us might have heard from our faith traditions, which would suggest that, the Lord works in mysterious ways. That's echoed in the background of this. It also suggests a kind of optimism that nature is working always as it must, and if we can't understand that, we can't understand it only because we're not meant to. Uh, I want us to think about those ideas, and when we're meeting during our class meeting on Thursday, I want us to think about Pope's ideas that whatever is right, and how those intersect with some of the ideas of Swift. In some ways, the optimism, to whatever degree there is genuine optimism in this poem, seems really, really far removed from Swift's satire. And I want us to think about how they're different. I also want us to think about what they share in common. That's going to be our task. I'm going to give you one other assignment that I want for Thursday. I want you to find a favorite couplet within this poem and be willing to share that couplet with us, and also tell us why that couplet's your favorite and what meaning you discover in it. So that'll be our task for Thursday. I'll see you all then. Take care.